The sound echoed across the beach like a crack of thunder. 22 nurses stood in a straight line in the shallow water, their white uniforms slowly darkening where the ocean touched the fabric. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They had already made their decision. Moments earlier, a soldier had raised his rifle toward them. The nurses had stepped forward together, their Red Cross armbands visible in the sunlight, their hands empty. They were not soldiers. They were nurses. The rifle fired, but the bullet never struck any of them. Instead, it passed through the humid tropical air and buried itself in the wet sand just beyond the line of women. For a moment, no one moved. The ocean rolled quietly against the shore. The nurses waited. And for 77 years, almost nobody outside their small group would know how close that moment had come to changing everything. To understand how those 22 nurses ended up on a remote tropical beach, you have to go back to February of 1942. The city of Singapore was in crisis. For decades it had been considered an unbreakable fortress of the British Empire. But during the rapid advance that led to the fall of Singapore, everything changed. Military commanders watched as defensive lines collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. Thousands of soldiers were wounded. Hospitals overflowed with patients. And among the people working around the clock were a group of Australian military nurses assigned to a field hospital. They had spent weeks doing the work they had trained for, cleaning wounds, stabilizing patients, comforting frightened young soldiers who had never imagined war would arrive so suddenly. But by the second week of February, even the hospitals were no longer safe. Orders came down from headquarters. Evacuation. There were 22 of them. Young women, most in their early 20s, trained in hospitals across Australia before volunteering for wartime service. Some had worked in city hospitals. Others had trained in rural clinics. But they all shared the same routine: long shifts, steady hands, and the quiet discipline that nursing demanded. When the evacuation order arrived, they packed only the essentials. Medical kits, a few personal belongings, their white nursing uniforms. One of the nurses later wrote in a diary that the hardest part of leaving the hospital was walking past the patients they could not take with them. War forced difficult choices. And this was one of them. The docks of Singapore were crowded with ships trying to escape before the city fell completely. Civilians, wounded soldiers, and medical staff moved through the chaos as officers tried to organize departures. The nurses were assigned to a small evacuation vessel that would attempt to reach safer territory further south. The ship was not large, but it was one of the last available. For 2 days, the vessel moved cautiously through island waters. At night, the lights stayed dark to avoid detection. During the day, everyone waited anxiously for aircraft overhead. The nurses spent most of their time below deck caring for injured passengers. Even while evacuating, their work never stopped. By the third day, the captain realized reaching the original destination might be impossible. Enemy patrols had been reported along the route. Instead, the ship turned toward a scattered chain of small islands off the coast of Indonesia. One of those islands was Bangka Island. The plan was simple: land temporarily, allow the wounded to rest, then continue the journey once conditions were safer. But war rarely follows simple plans. When the nurses finally stepped onto the sand, the island felt strangely peaceful. Palm trees swayed gently above the beach. Birds moved through the canopy of the jungle. For the first time in days, the nurses could hear something other than engines and distant artillery. But they knew they were still in dangerous territory. Working together, they quickly organized a temporary medical station beneath the trees. Training took over immediately. Bandages were prepared. Water was collected. Patients were placed in the shade. Despite exhaustion, the nurses continued doing exactly what they had always done: helping people. The patrol arrives. Late that afternoon, one of the civilians on the beach noticed movement at the edge of the jungle. A small patrol was approaching. The atmosphere changed instantly. Everyone understood what that meant. The nurses gathered together to decide what to do. Running into the jungle with injured patients was impossible. Hiding was unrealistic. So they chose the only option that felt honest. They would identify themselves clearly as medical personnel. Under international law, nurses and doctors were protected as non-combatants. It was not a guarantee, but it was their best chance. When the patrol reached the beach, the nurses stepped forward together. They walked slowly into the shallow water, so their uniforms and Red Cross armbands would be clearly visible. The soldiers stopped. For several seconds, both groups simply watched each other. Then one soldier raised his rifle. The nurses did not run. They did not shout. They stood quietly in the water. A single shot rang out. The bullet struck the sand. Then an officer shouted an order. The rifles lowered. The tension broke like a wave pulling back into the sea. The patrol escorted the group inland. Within days, the nurses and other survivors were transporting to an internment camp in the dense jungles of Sumatra. Life inside the camp was difficult. Food was limited. Medicine was even more limited. But the nurses quickly reorganized themselves into a functioning medical unit. They cleaned wounds, treated infections, and improvised treatments using whatever materials they could find. For many prisoners, the presence of trained nurses made survival possible. The small medical hut they built became the heart of the camp. The years pass. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. The nurses supported each other through illness, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Even in captivity, they continued practicing the profession they had trained for. Caring for others, encouraging one another, maintaining discipline and routine. It was the only way to endure the long years of war. When the conflict finally ended in 1945, prisoners across Southeast Asia were gradually released. The nurses returned home to Australia. Families welcomed them back. Communities celebrated their survival. But one part of their story remained almost unknown. The moment on the beach. The moment when 22 nurses had stood quietly in the water and waited to see what would happen. In the years after the war, military officials collected testimonies from returning personnel. But some stories were considered too sensitive to release publicly. The beach encounter was one of them. Leaders worried the event might complicate diplomatic relationships in the fragile post-war world. So the full account was archived quietly inside military records. Decades passed. Many people assumed the story had been forgotten. Years later, historians began studying evacuation routes from Singapore during the war. They discovered scattered references to the group of nurses and their unexpected landing on Banker Island. Diaries, letters, official reports. Piece by piece, the full story began to reappear. Finally, after 77 years, researchers were able to reconstruct the moment almost exactly. The line of nurses in the water. The single shot. The bullet that missed. Today the story is remembered not as a battle, but as a moment of quiet courage. 22 nurses standing together in the middle of a war. Unarmed, calm, professional even in the most uncertain moment imaginable. They had stepped into the water not knowing what would happen next. And somehow that calm decision changed the course of their story. Sometimes history turns on huge battles. Sometimes it turns on strategy. But sometimes it turns on something much simpler. A line of nurses in the ocean. And a single bullet that missed.